Welcome to Fireside Casebook. Come in. There's another mystery waiting by the fire.
Chapter 1. The unwelcome Sassenach, and the cold coffee the wind howling off the sea lock carried with it, the distinct, bitter promise of a miserable Tuesday. It whipped across the slate, grey waters battered the whitewashed cottages of Lochaber, and rattled the windows of the local police station with malicious intent. Inside, Police Constable Hamish Macbeth was engaged in his most fiercely protected police duty. Absolutely nothing. Hamish was sprawled in a battered armchair by the kitchen stove. His long, lanky legs stretched out toward the radiating warmth. His fiery red hair was standing on end, uncombed, and his hazel eyes were half closed in a look of profound, practiced indolence. Beside him, his mongrel dog, Lugs, let out a deep, rumbling sigh and rested his chin on Hamish's boot. Suddenly, the black telephone on the hallway desk began to shrill. Hamish did not move. He merely opened one eye and glared at the instrument. It rang 5 times, 6 times, 7 times. He knew exactly who it was. The sharp, demanding cadence of the ring had Detective Chief Inspector Blair's name written all over it. Blair, stationed in the grim, concrete monstrosity of Strathbane headquarters, was a loud, bullying man who viewed Hamish with a mixture of intense suspicion and profound contempt. Hamish returned the sentiment, though he hid it behind a mask of vacant stupidity. If he answered, Blair would surely find some tedious, soul-crushing task for him to do, or worse, drag him into a case that might lead to an accidental commendation. The greatest terror in Hamish Macbeth's life was not a knife-wielding murderer, but the threat of a promotion. A promotion meant a transfer to Strathbane, wearing a proper uniform, and actually having to work. He preferred his beloved, isolated Lochaber, where he could poach a salmon in peace and manage the village on his own quiet terms. The ringing finally ceased. Hamish let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Right, Lugs," Hamish said, slowly hoisting his 6-foot-plus frame from the chair. "I think we've survived the morning rush. Let's go mooch a cup of coffee and a bacon roll before the world ends." He threw his police tunic over his shoulders, leaving the brass buttons stubbornly unfastened, jammed his peaked cap onto his red head, and stepped out into the biting Highland chill. The village of Lochaber was a picturesque line of cottages curving around the waterfront, backed by looming heather-clad mountains that looked brooding and black under the heavy rain clouds. The air smelled sharply of salt spray, wet seaweed, and peat smoke. It was a harsh, beautiful place, and Hamish loved every sodden inch of it. He ambled down the single main road, his hands deep in his pockets, offering a lazy nod to the few locals brave enough to be out in the wind. His destination was Patel's General Store, the pulsing heart of Lochaber's gossip network. As he approached, however, he heard a sound that instantly set his teeth on edge. It was a voice, a loud, braying, upper-class English voice, echoing out of the open door of the shop. "I completely fail to understand," the voice was saying, dripping with condescension, "how a supposedly functional grocery establishment in the 21st century does not carry organic, fair-trade macadamia milk. Do you expect me to put this mass-produced bovine sludge in my tea?" Hamish paused at the threshold. A sleek silver Range Rover, so clean it looked offensive against the mud of the Highlands, was parked haphazardly on the pavement outside. Hamish sighed. A Sassenach, and a rich, angry one at that. He stepped inside. Mr. Meist. Patel was standing behind the counter, looking thoroughly exasperated, while a stout, red-faced man in a violently expensive, brand-new tweed suit was waving a standard carton of milk in the air. The man's face was flushed with the kind of indignant rage usually reserved for minor aristocrats who had been denied a table at a fancy London restaurant. Standing quietly just behind the angry man was a striking contrast. A tall, thin man in his late 50s, dressed entirely in black, complete with a stark white clerical collar. He had a pale, ascetic face, sharp cheekbones, and dark, watchful eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the shop. "Mornin', Mr. Patel," Hamish said, adopting his thickest, slowest Highland drawl. He let his shoulders slump and pasted a look of vacant amiability on his face. Terrible weather for the time of year. The red-faced man whirled around. He looked Hamish up and down, taking in the unbuttoned tunic and the general air of untidiness. "And who the devil are you?" he barked. "Constable Macbeth, sir," Hamish said cheerfully, touching the brim of his cap. "At your service." "Is there a wee bit of a problem with the milk?" "The problem, Constable, is the absolute lack of civilization in this backwater," the man snapped. "I am Arthur Pendleton. I have just purchased the old Craigmore estate on the hill. I am converting it into a high-end spiritual wellness retreat. My guests will expect a certain standard of living, not this medieval squalor." Hamish blinked slowly, letting a good 10 seconds of silence stretch out. He looked at the carton of milk, then at Pendleton, then back at the milk. "Well, sir," Hamish said gently, "cows don't produce much macadamia up here. Mostly they just eat the grass and give us milk. If you're looking for civilization, you might have taken a wrong turn at Inverness." Pendleton's face turned an even deeper shade of magenta. "Are you being insolent with me, officer?" "Oh, no, sir," Hamish said, his eyes widening in feigned innocence. "Just statin' the agricultural facts. We're very simple folk here in Lochdevoff." He turned his gaze to the silent priest. "And you'll be the spiritual part of the wellness, I'm guessin'." The priest stepped forward, his expression calm and unreadable. His voice, when he spoke, was smooth and cultured. "I am Father Julian Cedric, Constable. Mr. Pendleton has kindly brought me on to offer guidance and hear the confessions of our retreat guests, a place for the troubled souls of the city to find peace." Hamish felt a prickle of unease run down his spine. He had learned long ago to trust his instincts, and there was something entirely too still about Father Julian. The man's eyes were like black stones at the bottom of a cold lock. "Confessions, eh?" Hamish murmured, leaning against the counter and casually snagging a wrapped flapjack from a display box. "Well, Father, the only thing most folks in Lochdevoff have to confess is tackin', the Lord's name in vain when the midges are out. You might find it a bit quiet for your line of work." "I find," Father Julian said softly, "that human nature is the same everywhere, Constable. There is sin in the city, and there is sin in the quietest of villages. It only needs the right environment to reveal itself." Pendleton scoffed loudly. "Don't waste your breath, Julian. This local plod wouldn't know a spiritual crisis if it arrested him. Come along. We shall have to drive all the way to Strathbane to find decent provisions." He slammed the milk carton onto the counter and stormed out of the shop, the little bell above the door jingling frantically. Father Julian offered Hamish a small, perfectly polite nod, and followed his benefactor out into the rain. Hamish watched through the window as the gleaming Range Rover sped away, splashing mud onto the pavement. "Good riddance," muttered Mr. Patel, adjusting his glasses. "Spiritual retreat. That man has a spirit like a rusty nail. He was complaining about the smell of the sea yesterday. Said it was intrusive." Hamish chuckled, peeling the wrapper off his flapjack. "He'll not last the winter, Mr. Patel. The damp will get into his expensive tweeds, and he'll be scuttling back to London." "I hope so, Hamish," Patel sighed. "But I don't like the look of that priest. He looked at my cash register, like he knew exactly how much was in it." "Aye," Hamish said softly, the facade of the lazy village bobby dropping for just a fraction of a second. His hazel eyes were sharp and thoughtful. "He's a quiet one, that Father Julian, and it's the quiet ones that usually hear the most." Hamish paid for his flapjack, successfully mooched a free cup of coffee from Mr. Patel's personal thermos, and headed back out into the wind. He took a sip of the scalding, bitter liquid and stared up the hill toward the old Craigmore estate. Money, arrogance, and a priest who specialized in other people's dark secrets. It was a toxic combination to drop into a tight-knit Highland community. Hamish whistled for lugs, a heavy feeling settling in his stomach that had nothing to do with Mr. Patel's coffee. His peaceful, lazy week was already slipping away. He just hoped that whatever trouble Arthur Pendleton and Father Julian brought to Lochdevoff, it wouldn't force him to do any actual police work. Chapter 2. The peat bog spa and a ruined breakfast the next morning broke over Lochdevoff with a heavy clinging mist that reduced the mountains to vague, threatening shadows. In the police station kitchen, Hamish Macbeth was engaged in a holy ritual. 4 thick rashers of local bacon were spitting aggressively in a cast iron skillet on his beloved stove, accompanied by 2 perfectly fried eggs and a generous slab of black pudding. Luggs was sitting at attention, his tail giving an occasional, hopeful thump against the cracked linoleum. Hamish had just slid a thick slice of bread into the hot bacon fat to fry, the absolute pinnacle of Highland gastronomy, when the heavy wooden door of the police station burst open with a frantic crash. "Hamish, for the love of God, man, come quick." Hamish closed his eyes and let out a long, tragic sigh. He looked longingly at the sizzling pan. Then he turned to see Angus Curry, a local handyman whose normal pace of life was best described as glacial, standing in the doorway. Angus was panting heavily, his face the colour of old porridge, and his green Wellington boots were caked in fresh, black mud. "It's a terrible thing, Hamish," Angus gasped, clutching the door frame to steady himself. "Up at the Craigmore estate, that new English fellow, the loud one with the fancy motor." "Mr. Pendleton," Hamish asked slowly, casually lifting the pan off the heat to save his fried bread from burning. "Has he complained about the lack of avocado toast?" "Angus, because that's not a police matter, and I'm busy." "He's dead, Hamish, drowned in the muck." The last lingering hope of a peaceful Wednesday evaporated into the damp air. Hamish carefully set the skillet aside, grabbed his peaked cap, and whistled for Luggs. "Right, Angus. Show me." The drive up the winding, potholed track to the Craigmore estate was treacherous in the mist. When they finally pulled up to the imposing Victorian mansion, Hamish found that Pendleton's grand vision for a wellness retreat had already scarred the beautiful landscape. A large, rectangular pit had been excavated on the front lawn, surrounded by slippery wooden deckings. It was intended to be a luxury peat bath, a medicinal mud spa for wealthy city folk seeking rustic rejuvenation. It had certainly provided Arthur Pendleton with a permanent rest. The red-faced Sassenach was face down in the thick black ooze. He was wearing nothing but a pair of outrageously expensive silk boxer shorts. His arms were outflung, and the back of his bald head was covered in a thick, congealing layer of muck. Hamish shoved his hands deep into his pockets and ambled over to the edge of the pit, his face a perfect mask of lazy indifference. Inwardly, however, his sharp hazel eyes missed absolutely nothing. He noted the pristine pile of folded tweed clothing on a nearby deck chair. He noted the heavy, silver-handled walking stick lying discarded in the wet grass a good 10 feet away, and he noted the complete lack of struggle around the muddy edges of the pit. "I came up early to start on the plumbing for the showers," Angus whimpered from a safe distance, refusing to look at the pit. "Found him just like that. Didn't touch a thing, Hamish. I swear on my mother's grave." "You did right, Angus," Hamish murmured. "A tragic accident, wouldn't you say, Constable?" Hamish didn't jump, though he hadn't heard anyone approach over the sound of the wind. He turned his head slowly to find Father Julian standing a few yards away. The priest was dressed in his usual immaculate black, blending seamlessly into the morning mist. His dark eyes rested on the body with an unsettling calmness, completely devoid of shock, grief, or pity. "Accident, Father?" Hamish asked, his Highland drawl thickening defensively. "Now, why would ye say a thing like that?" "It seems obvious," Father Julian said smoothly, stepping closer but carefully avoiding the muddy grass. Mr. Pendleton was eager to test his new facilities. He must have slipped in the damp, struck his head, and unfortunately drowned before he could right himself. A terrible shame. Hamish looked back at the body, then at the silver-handled walking stick lying conspicuously out of reach. He looked at the priest's impeccably clean, polished black leather shoes, not a single speck of mud on them. "Aye, well, it's a slippery slope, this wellness business," Hamish agreed mildly, though his mind was racing. Men who slipped accidentally usually thrashed about, trying to find purchase, leaving marks in the soft earth. Pendleton looked as though he had been pushed flat and held there. Furthermore, a pompous man like Pendleton wouldn't take a midnight dip in a freezing Highland peat bog unless he was meeting someone. Hamish sighed heavily, mourning his cold bacon and the inevitable mountain of paperwork. But more than that, he mourned the loss of his peace, because as sure as the rain fell in Lochdebuff, He knew he was going to have to make the call. "Right, Angus," Hamish said, scratching the back of his neck and looking supremely unintelligent. "You'd better go down to the hotel and get yourself a stiff dram. I'll need to use the telephone in the big house. Detective Chief Inspector Blair is going to be fierce annoyed. I've woken him up for a spot of mud wrestling." Father Julian offered a thin, chilling smile. "I shall pray for Mr. Pendleton's soul, Constable." "You do that, Father," Hamish muttered, turning toward the mansion, Lugs trotting faithfully at his heels. "I think he's going to need all the help he can get." Chapter 3. The Strathbane Circus and the Trampled Clues. By the time the discordant wail of police sirens finally echoed up the glen, tearing through the quiet isolation of Lochdabuff, Hamish Macbeth was soaked to the bone. The fine morning mist had thickened into a driving, relentless rain. Hamish stood by the peat bog, under a large, dripping golf umbrella he had liberated from the estate's mudroom, with Lugs huddled miserably against his boots. He had thoughtfully covered the late Arthur Pendleton with a plastic tarpaulin, though the man was already as wet and muddy as it was physically possible to be. Two police rovers came tearing up the driveway, their tires spinning and tearing deep, ugly gashes into the manicured gravel. The doors flew open, and the Strathbane Circus had officially arrived. Leading the charge was Detective Chief Inspector Blair. Blair was a short, heavily built man with a permanent scowl, a complexion like a boiled lobster, and a wardrobe that consisted entirely of cheap, poorly fitted suits. He smelled faintly of stale cigarette smoke, strong peppermints, and a lingering hint of cheap whiskey. Behind him trudged Detective Inspector Jimmy Anderson, a man who looked perpetually hungover and deeply resentful of the fresh Highland air. "Macbeth," Blair bellowed, his voice cutting through the wind like a foghorn. "You useless, lanky streak of Highland misery. What in the name of God have you got me out of a warm bed for?" "Murder, sir," Hamish said mildly, not moving an inch to offer Blair the shelter of his umbrella. "Or so it would appear to my simple mind." Blair snorted, a wet, unpleasant sound, and stomped directly across the wet grass, his heavy brogues obliterating any subtle footprints that might have been left near the decking. Hamish suppressed a wince. It was a marvel, really, that Blair ever solved a case given his tendency to treat crime scenes like a rugby pitch. Blair yanked back the tarpaulin. He stared at the half-submerged, silk-clad posterior of Arthur Pendleton for a long moment. Rain battered against his bald head. "Murder," Blair sneered, rounding on Hamish. "You call this murder, you lazy peasant. The man's in his underwear by a mud bath. He slipped, hit his thick head, and drowned. It's an accidental death. Any half-wit could see that." "Aye, sir," Hamish drawled, his eyes wide and vacant. "I'm sure you're right, only he's a fair distance from the edge, isn't he? And there's no mud on the deck where he might have slipped. Just grass." Blair's face darkened dangerously. He hated it when Hamish pointed out facts. He hated Hamish's calm demeanour. But most of all, he hated that Hamish was occasionally right. "Don't you try and get clever with me, Macbeth," Blair growled, stepping closer and jabbing a stubby finger into Hamish's chest. "I do the thinking, you do the directing of traffic." Blair looked around the scene, his eyes landing on the silver-handled walking stick lying in the grass. He marched over and scooped it up with his bare hand, completely ruining any chance of pulling a fingerprint from it. "Look at this," Blair crowed triumphantly, waving the stick. "It's heavy, solid silver, probably worth a fortune." "Where is his wallet, Macbeth?" "I couldn't say, sir. I haven't searched his pockets, seeing as he's not wearing any." "Exactly," Blair barked, ignoring the logic. "It's a robbery gone wrong. Some local poacher or desperate tinker came up here to nick his valuables. The English bloke caught him. There was a struggle, and he ended up in the muck. Who found the body?" "Angus Curry, sir. He's down at the hotel having a restorative dram." Blair's eyes lit up with predatory glee. Angus Curry had a minor record for poaching salmon 10 years ago, in Blair's lazy, prejudiced mind, that made him a prime suspect. "Anderson," Blair shouted to his shivering subordinate, "get down to the hotel and drag Curry in. Put the fear of God into him. We'll have a confession by lunchtime, and be back in Strathbane for a pint." Hamish stood quietly, his face a picture of bovine stupidity. Internally, He was cataloguing the sheer incompetence unfolding before him. The muddled scene. Blair had trampled the approach to the pit. The compromised weapon. Blair was currently leaning on the victim's walking stick, like a country squire. The wrong suspect. Angus Curry was terrified of his own shadow, let alone capable of drowning a grown man in cold mud. "What are you staring at, Macbeth?" Blair snapped, noticing Hamish's unblinking gaze. "Just admiring your swift deduction, sir," Hamish said, his voice entirely devoid of sarcasm. "It's a marvel to watch a real detective at work." Blair puffed out his chest, slightly mollified. "See that you learn from it, then. Now, clear off. The real police are here. Go and stand at the bottom of the road, and make sure no reporters get up here. And don't touch anything." "Yes, Mr. Blair," Hamish said obediently. He tipped his cap, turned, and whistled for lugs. As he walked away from the circus of shouting Strathbane detectives, a small, genuine smile touched the corners of his mouth. Blair was occupied with the wrong man, the wrong theory, and the wrong crime. That meant Hamish was completely free to amble down to the village, dry off by a warm fire, and start asking the right questions over a plate of scones and a pot of hot tea. The real investigation was about to begin. Chapter 4. Gossip, scones, and the vicar's secret. The interior of the Lochdaboth Hotel was a sanctuary of peeling wallpaper, worn velvet armchairs, and the comforting, slightly burnt aroma of fresh baking. Hamish shook the rain from his coat and stepped into the lounge, where the warmth of the roaring peat fire hit him like a physical embrace. He found Mrs. Danvers, the sharp-tongued, eagle-eyed manager of the hotel, leaning over the counter and whispering furiously to the local postmistress, Miss Agnes. They stopped talking the moment Hamish entered, their faces transforming into masks of innocent curiosity. "Morning, Mrs. Danvers," Hamish said, peeling off his wet cap. "I'll be needing a massive pot of tea and enough scones to kill a horse. It's been a long, wet morning." "We heard, Hamish," Mrs. Danvers said, her eyes glinting. "The village is buzzing. They say that arrogant Sassenach was found face down in his own muck pit. Is it true?" "It is," Hamish replied, sinking into his favourite armchair near the hearth. He watched as Lugs curled up on the rug, already asleep. DCI Blair is up there now, convinced it was a robbery. The two women exchanged a look of profound scepticism. "Robbery," Miss Agnes snorted. "That man didn't have a penny on him worth stealing that he didn't already have tied up in his spiritual investments. Though, I suppose one could say his life was worth taking." Hamish poured himself a cup of tea, letting the steam rise against his face. "Did he have many visitors then, apart from the priest?" Mrs. Danvers set a plate of buttered scones down on the low table with a thud. "Visitors? He didn't want visitors. He wanted sycophants. He'd been holding private sessions up at the house all week. Claimed he could unlock people's past life traumas. A load of rubbish, if you ask me. He was a fraud," Miss Agnes added, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. But he had a way with words. He had the vicar, Mr. Graves, up there 3 times this week. Poor old man came back looking like he'd seen a ghost every single time. Hamish paused, a scone halfway to his mouth. The vicar. Why would Mr. Graves be seeing a wellness retreat host? "He wouldn't say," Mrs. Danvers murmured, leaning in. "But I saw them arguing in the parking lot of the church on Tuesday. The vicar was practically shaking, and that Pendleton fellow was smiling, that thin, nasty smile he had. He was holding a piece of paper, like a letter. He was waving it under Mr. Graves' nose like a threat." Hamish chewed thoughtfully. The pieces were starting to shift. Arthur Pendleton wasn't just an arrogant tourist. He was a man who collected information, and in a village like Lochdaboth, information was the only currency that mattered. "Anything else?" Hamish asked, his voice low. "Just the priest," Miss Agnes chimed in. "Father Julian. I saw him at the pub late last night. He wasn't drinking. He was just sitting in the corner, writing in a small black notebook. He looked satisfied, Hamish. Not happy, mind you, just satisfied, like a man who's finished a long, difficult job." Hamish finished his tea and stood up, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Blair was currently interrogating Angus Curry, who would be weeping and swearing his innocence by now. While the police were busy with the wrong man, the real threads of the mystery were pulling tight in the shadows of the village. "I need to have a wee word with Mr. Graves," Hamish said, adjusting his cap. "He's at the rectory, tending his roses," Mrs. Danvers said, "though, with this rain, he's likely in the greenhouse." As Hamish left the hotel and stepped back into the drizzle, he felt a flicker of the old excitement he usually tried to bury. He wasn't just a lazy policeman anymore. He was a man with a puzzle, and he was beginning to think that Pendleton's death was less about a missing wallet and more about a secret that needed to stay buried. He walked past the quiet churchyard, the ancient tombstones, standing like silent witnesses in the grey light. He spotted the vicar in the glass-walled greenhouse, kneeling in the dirt, his hands covered in soil. As Hamish approached, the vicar looked up, his face pale and lined with a deep, encroaching exhaustion. "Constable," Mr. Graves said, his voice brittle, "I suppose you've come to ask about Arthur." "I have, vicar," Hamish said, leaning against the damp glass. "I understand you were quite close, or, at least, you spent quite a bit of time with him lately." The vicar stood up, his joints popping, and wiped his hands on his apron. He looked at Hamish, his eyes watery and desperate. "Close. No, Hamish, I wasn't close. I was trapped, and God help me. I think I was waiting for someone to set me free." Hamish didn't speak. He simply stood there, an unkempt, slow-moving figure, waiting for the silence to work its magic. He knew that if he just stayed quiet, the truth would eventually spill out, like rain from an overfilled bucket, and by the look on the vicar's face, the bucket was very, very full. Chapter 5. The weight of a vicar's soul. The silence inside the greenhouse was thick, broken only by the steady drum of rain against the glass panes. Mr. Graves stood motionless, his fingers trembling as he gripped a small hand trowel. He seemed to be staring through the glass, his eyes fixed on some distant, dark horizon. Hamish didn't rush him. He leaned back against the framing, looking for all the world like a man with nowhere better to be, perhaps contemplating the weather or the price of oats. He let the silence stretch, heavy and suffocating, until the vicar could no longer bear the pressure of his own unspoken burdens. "He wasn't a man, Hamish," the vicar whispered, his voice cracking. "He was a ledger. He carried a little black book, and in it he kept the missteps of every person in this village." Hamish raised an eyebrow, feigning a look of confused interest. "Black books? Sounds a bit dramatic, doesn't it, vicar? Like something out of a penny dreadful." "I wish it were, Mr. Graves replied, turning to face him. His eyes were red-rimmed and filled with a profound soul-crushing shame. "3 years ago, before I came to Lockdorboth, I made a mistake, a financial error involving the parish funds in my previous post. It was a lapse of judgment, a moment of weakness, and it was corrected, but the shame remained. Pendleton found out. He wasn't interested in justice. He was interested in control. He wanted the church land. He wanted to bulldoze the old chapel to expand his wellness parking lot." Hamish felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the damp. So, it wasn't just a petty grudge. It was calculated, long-term extortion. "Did he tell anyone else?" Hamish asked softly. "He told me he would show the Board of Bishops if I didn't sign the transfer documents by the end of the week," the vicar said, dropping the trowel onto the potting bench with a clatter. "I spent the last 3 nights begging him, praying for him to have mercy, but he only laughed. He told me that in his world morality was just a commodity for the poor." Hamish thought of the body in the mud, the silk shorts, the lack of struggle, the arrogance that had been silenced in the most undignified manner possible, and the priest, Father Julian. Did he know about the book? The vicar's face clouded over with a different emotion, fear. "Father Julian isn't just a priest, Hamish. I suspect he was Pendleton's partner, not his employee. He was always there, standing in the shadows, listening. When Pendleton threatened me, Julian would just watch, his face as cold as a statue. I think the notebook didn't die with Pendleton. I think Julian has it now." Hamish nodded slowly, absorbing the information. The power dynamic of the spiritual retreat had been shifted. If Father Julian had been the silent partner, and if he now possessed the ledger, he was the most dangerous man in Lockdorboth. "Vicar," Hamish said, his tone shifting from the lazy local bobby to something much sharper. Did you see anyone else up at the house last night? Anything out of the ordinary? The vicar hesitated, wiping sweat from his forehead, despite the cold. I saw a car, a dark sedan, not a local one. It was parked down the lane, hidden by the gorse bushes. I didn't see who was driving, but I saw someone leave it and walk toward the mansion around midnight. They were wearing a hooded coat, but they walked with a very distinct limp. Hamish froze. A limp. "Thank you, Vicar," Hamish said, his voice unusually brisk. "Keep this between us for now. If Blair asks, you were here, working on your roses, and you didn't see a soul. Are you going to arrest him, Hamish?" Hamish turned toward the door, his silhouette framed by the swirling mist outside. "I'm going to make sure the right person finds what they're looking for, and hopefully keep the rest of you out of the line of fire." As he stepped out into the rain, Hamish's mind was whirring. He needed to find that car, and he needed to figure out exactly how a man with a limp fitted into the puzzle. He knew one thing for certain. DCI Blair was currently down at the station, likely bullying poor Angus Curry into a false confession, completely oblivious to the fact that a far more lethal game was being played right under his nose. Hamish whistled for lugs. They had a dark sedan to find, and if his theory was correct, the owner of that car was going to lead him straight to the heart of the mystery, and perhaps to the man who had truly silenced Arthur Pendleton. He just had to make sure he did it without DCI Blair noticing, or he'd be filing reports in Strathbane until he retired. Chapter 6. The Limping Stranger and the Trail of Mud. The rain had settled into that persistent, soul-dampening drizzle that the Highlands were famous for. Hamish, his coat collar turned up against the wind, bypassed the main road. He knew the back lanes, the narrow, rutted tracks that local farmers used to move sheep, far better than any outsider or city-based policeman. If a mysterious car had been hidden near the estate, it wouldn't have been left on the main thoroughfare. "Come on, lugs," Hamish whispered, his eyes scanning the thick gorse bushes that lined the perimeter of the Craigmore estate. They moved like ghosts through the wet foliage. Hamish didn't look like a policeman. He looked like a poacher, his movements fluid and soundless. He knew every dip in the terrain, every soft patch of moss that would swallow the sound of his footsteps. About half a mile from the main entrance, hidden in a disused, overgrown cattle pen, they found it. A dark, nondescript sedan, its paint dull with road grime, and its plates coated in a thick, purposeful layer of mud. It was tucked well away from the road, invisible to anyone but a keen observer. Hamish approached cautiously, his hand hovering near his pocket. He peered through the driver's side window. The interior was empty, but he noted a pair of discarded leather gloves on the passenger seat, and a single, crinkled receipt from a high-end delicatessen in Edinburgh tucked into the door handle. He didn't touch anything. He knew better than to leave his own prints, but he memorized the details. As he was turning to leave, a sound caught his ear. The rhythmic, dragging thump, scrape of someone walking with a pronounced limp. Hamish pulled lugs behind a thick patch of heather and held his breath. A figure emerged from the tree line, heading toward the car. It was a man in a long, dark raincoat with the hood pulled low. He moved with agonizing slowness, his left leg dragging behind him. He reached the car, fumbled with the key, and opened the door. Hamish recognized the silhouette immediately. It wasn't Father Julian. It was someone far more familiar to the village, Mr. Mackenzie, the local solicitor, a man who had handled the legal paperwork for every property sale in Lochduff for the last 20 years. Hamish waited until the man had started the engine and driven off, the tires spinning on the slick mud. He didn't stop him. He needed to know where he was going. He stood up, signaled to lugs, and they began a silent, cross-country pursuit, keeping the car's taillights in sight as it navigated the winding, treacherous road back toward the village. The car didn't head for the solicitor's office. It turned up toward the church. Hamish ducked into the shadows of the stone wall as the sedan pulled to a stop in the churchyard. Mackenzie climbed out, his limp more pronounced in the cold. He walked, or rather, dragged himself, toward the vestry door. Hamish moved closer, creeping along the perimeter of the ancient gravestones until he was pressed against the cold stone of the church wall. He could hear voices inside the dimly lit vestry. "I told you not to come here." A voice hissed. It was Father Julian, his tone stripped of its usual priestly warmth, replaced by a jagged, sharp edge. "The police are swarming. If they see you, it's over." I had to. Mackenzie's voice came back, strained and panicked. "Pendleton was going to ruin me, Julian. He knew about the land registry fraud. He was going to expose the illegal transfers on the Craigmore deed. He would have had me in prison by the end of the month." Hamish's heart hammered against his ribs. The motive wasn't just jealousy or a petty secret. It was a desperate, high-stakes cover-up. "You killed him for that, Father?" Julian asked, his voice chillingly calm. "I didn't have a choice," Mackenzie cried. "He was meeting me by that wretched mud pit. He was mocking me, showing me the files, laughing at my life's work. I pushed him. He slipped. He didn't even fight back. He just went under, and he stayed under." "And the notebook?" Julian prompted. "I took it," Mackenzie whispered. "It's in the car. I burned the pages with the evidence against me, but the rest, it's all here. Julian, we have to destroy it. If the police find it, they'll know everything about the land scheme." Hamish held his breath. This was it, the confession. "Give it to me," Julian commanded. "I will dispose of it, and then we both disappear. You've done your part, Mackenzie, now. Let the church handle the penance." Hamish realized with a jolt that the priest wasn't protecting Mackenzie. He was reclaiming the leverage. If Julian got that notebook, he would hold the keys to the entire village's secrets. Hamish reached for his radio. He needed to alert Blair. But the thought stopped him. If he called it in now, Blair would barge in, probably let Mackenzie slip away, and then claim he solved the case himself, leaving the notebook to fall into the hands of someone as dangerous as the priest. He had to move now. He had to be smarter, faster, and much more devious than the DCI. He looked at Luggs, who gave a soft, encouraging whine. "Right, boy," Hamish murmured, his eyes alight with a dangerous, quiet fire. "Time to stir the pot." Chapter 7. The trap of the whispering wind. Hamish didn't reach for his radio. Instead, he pulled a small silver whistle from his pocket. Not the one he used for Luggs, but a high-pitched emergency signal device he kept for true crises. He didn't want the police yet. He wanted a diversion. He crept toward the back of the churchyard, where a large, iron-wrought bell hung in a small belfry, unused since the last major renovation. He jammed a sturdy piece of gorse wood into the mechanism and gave the rope a sharp, violent tug. Clang-tong, clang-tong. The sound, deep and mournful, shattered the quiet of the rain-soaked village. It was a sound that had not been heard in Lochdover for decades. Inside the vestry, the sudden, booming noise acted like a thunderclap. Through the crack in the stone wall, Hamish watched the figures. Mackenzie jumped, his face turning an ash grey, while Father Julian spun toward the door, his composure finally fracturing. "What was that?" Mackenzie stammered. "Someone is here," Julian hissed, his eyes darting toward the vestry window. "The police must have tracked you. Go. Out the side door and into the woods. Take the back path to your house. I will stay here and claim I was searching for the source of the sound." Mackenzie didn't wait. He scrambled out the side door, his limp frantic and uncoordinated, as he stumbled into the darkness. Hamish waited a heartbeat, then made his move. He didn't follow the solicitor. He slipped into the vestry through the main door, his face twisted into an expression of exaggerated, wide-eyed alarm. Father Julian," Hamish shouted, acting the part of the confused local officer perfectly. "Did you hear that? The bell. It's an omen, sir, a bad one. I thought I saw someone running toward the rectory." Father Julian was standing by the altar, his back to the door, his hands hidden beneath his robes. He turned, his face shifting instantly from panic to a serene, chilly mask. "Constable," he said, his voice smooth as glass. "I was just about to investigate. It sounded like an animal had struck the bell mechanism." "An animal, is it?" Hamish said, scratching his head and looking around the room as if he were lost. "I could have sworn I saw a shadow near the back door. A man limping, looked like he was in a fair bit of a hurry. The priest didn't blink. I saw no one, Constable. Perhaps your eyes are playing tricks on you in the rain." Maybe so," Hamish agreed, his gaze drifting to the floor. He spotted what he was looking for, a small, rectangular impression in the dust, near the altar. where a book had recently been resting. Anyway, I'd better be getting back to the station. DCI Blair will have my head if I'm not back to hand out the coffee to his boys. He turned to leave, but stopped at the door. Oh, by the way, Father, if you do see anyone wandering about in this weather, you'd best be careful. The roads are a nightmare tonight, and we've had reports of some funny business up at the Craigmore house. Seems someone's been settling scores. I am a man of peace, Constable, Julian said, his eyes tracking Hamish with predatory intensity. I only deal in the truth. That's a comfort, that is, Hamish said, tipping his cap. A real comfort. As he walked out into the rain, the grin dropped from Hamish's face. He hadn't just startled them, he had forced their hands. Mackenzie was now panicked and running, and the priest was now isolated and on the defensive. He didn't head for the police station. He headed for the old stone bridge that crossed the burn at the edge of the woods. The only way back to the village for anyone fleeing the churchyard on foot. He found a dry spot under the bridge, leaned against the cold stone, and waited. He knew Mackenzie was a creature of habit. He would take the most direct route home, which meant crossing this bridge. And if the solicitor was as desperate as he sounded, he would be looking to ditch that notebook before he got home. 10 minutes later, the steady thump-scrape of the solicitor's gate sounded on the wooden planks of the bridge. Mackenzie stopped midway, looking around frantically. He pulled a small, black notebook from his coat, hesitated, and then prepared to heave it into the rushing black water below. I wouldn't do that if I were you, Mr. Mackenzie. Hamish's voice drifted out of the darkness, calm and conversational. The solicitor screamed, dropping the book. It hit the wet grass of the bridge deck with a dull thud. Hamish stepped out of the shadows, his hands in his pockets, lugs silent and imposing at his side. It's a long walk to the station, and I'm afraid the weather is only getting worse, Hamish said, his voice lacking its usual lazy drawl. But I think it's time you and I had a long, honest talk about the price of land in Lochduff. Chapter 8. The weight of a confession. Mr. Mackenzie looked as though he had been struck by a bolt of lightning. He stood trembling on the narrow bridge, his face pale and slick with rain, his hands clawing at the collar of his coat. He looked at the black notebook lying on the damp planks, then at Hamish, and finally into the dark, churning waters of the burn below. You, Mackenzie wheezed, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. You've been following me. I have, Hamish said softly, moving closer, but making sure not to crowd him. And it's been a tiring evening for both of us. I'm sure you're cold, you're panicked, and you've got a bad leg. Why don't we just pick up the book, walk back to the station, and have a nice, hot cup of coffee? I've got a stove that's warmer than any jail cell in Strathbane. You don't understand, Mackenzie cried, his voice bordering on hysteria. Pendleton was a monster. He was tearing this village apart. He was going to take the church, the school, the land. He was going to turn us all into servants for his vanity. Maybe so, Hamish said, his tone still maddeningly calm. But murder isn't the way to run a planning committee, is it? You made a mistake, Mr. Mackenzie, a bad one, and now the law has to take its course. Mackenzie's shoulders slumped, the defiance drained out of him, leaving him looking like an old, broken man. He reached down, picked up the notebook, and held it out to Hamish. His hand was shaking so violently that the book nearly slipped from his fingers. The priest, Mackenzie whispered, his voice barely audible over the rush of the burn. Julian, he knew, he didn't just know Hamish. He encouraged it. He kept saying that the wicked must be pruned for the garden to grow. He knew what Pendleton was doing, and he let him push me until I finally snapped. He wanted this book. He wanted the power. Hamish took the notebook, feeling the weight of it. It was thick, filled with the secrets of a dozen prominent families in the region. It was a weapon, and Father Julian had been sharpening it for weeks. I believe you, Hamish said, but you're still the one who pushed him into the mud. He was laughing at me, Mackenzie sobbed. He was holding my future in his hand, and he was laughing. Hamish gently took the solicitor's arm, guiding him away from the edge of the bridge. He signalled lugs who fell in behind them, a silent sentry in the night. They walked back toward the village in silence, the rain soaking through their clothes. As they reached the edge of the village, the lights of the police station appeared, glowing warmly in the dark. But there was another set of lights parked outside, DCI Blair's official rover. its blue light flashing rhythmically, casting an eerie, pulsating glow over the wet cobblestones. Hamish stopped, his stomach tightening. Blair was still there, and by the look of the two constables standing guard, he was getting impatient. "Right, Mr. Mackenzie," Hamish said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "This is where the plan changes. You're going to walk into that station, you're going to put that notebook on the desk, and you're going to tell DCI Blair exactly what happened. You're going to confess to the murder, but you're going to be very, very clear about the priest's role in all of this. Understand?" "And what will you do?" Mackenzie asked, looking at him with wide, fearful eyes. "I'll be right behind you," Hamish lied. "I just need to check on something." He watched as the solicitor trudged toward the station door. As soon as Mackenzie entered, Hamish turned on his heel. He didn't need to be there for the confession. He needed to be somewhere else. He didn't go to the station. He went to the church. He knew Father Julian would be waiting. The priest was a man who planned, a man who expected his chess pieces to move exactly as he dictated. And right now, the most important piece, the notebook, was in the hands of the police, and the solicitor was likely spilling his guts. Hamish needed to see how the priest would react when he realized his pawn had reached the end of its move. He slipped into the shadows of the church porch, his hand resting on the cold iron of the door handle. He could hear a faint, rhythmic sound from inside, not the sound of someone praying, but the deliberate, methodical sound of someone tearing paper. Hamish pulled a small, heavy piece of metal from his pocket, a spare key he'd borrowed from the vicar weeks ago for emergency access, and eased the door open. The interior of the church was dim, lit only by a few flickering votive candles. Father Julian was standing at the altar, his back to the door, tearing pages out of a second, smaller ledger, the one containing his own personal accounts. "It's a bit late for bookkeeping, Father," Hamish said, his voice echoing in the vaulted stone space. The priest froze. He didn't turn around, but his posture stiffened, his shoulders squaring. "Constable," Julian said, his voice perfectly, terrifyingly steady, "I was just finishing my evening devotions. It seems you have a habit of appearing where you are least expected." "And you have a habit of being where the trouble is," Hamish replied, walking slowly down the centre aisle. "Mackenzie is at the station. He's telling Blair everything, and he has your partner's ledger." Father Julian turned around. He wasn't afraid. He was cold, analytical, and utterly dangerous. "A solicitor is a desperate man, Constable. His word is worth nothing in a court of law. And as for the ledger, that is merely hearsay." "Maybe," Hamish said, his eyes locking with the priest's. "But we have a local judge who doesn't like being played for a fool. And we have an entire village that's about to find out exactly what their spiritual guide has been hiding in his garden." The priest smiled, a thin, jagged expression that never reached his eyes. "You think you've won, Constable? You've only just started the war." Chapter 9. The devil in the vestry. The silence in the church was heavy, smelling of old wax, cold stone, and the sharp metallic tang of an approaching storm. Hamish stood in the centre aisle, his long, unkempt frame casting a long shadow toward the altar. He felt a prickle of genuine danger. He had faced armed criminals and desperate poachers, but Father Julian was different. He was a man who operated in the spaces between rules, a man for whom morality was merely a lever to be pulled. "You're very confident for a man in a wet uniform, Constable," Julian said, stepping down from the altar. He moved with a predatory grace, his black cassock swirling around his ankles like smoke. "Do you truly think a confession from a broken, limping man will stand against the word of the church?" "I don't know about the church, Father," Hamish replied, his voice dropping into that deceptively slow, rolling brogue that always made people underestimate him. "But I know the people of Lochtabuff. They're a stubborn lot. They don't take kindly to strangers who come here to poke around in their business, and they like it even less when those strangers turn out to be extortionists." "You are a peasant playing at being a detective," Julian sneered, his mask of saintly calm finally slipping. His eyes, usually so cold and unreadable, now burned with a dark, resentful fire. "You think you've solved a puzzle. You've only disrupted a necessary process." Arthur Pendleton was a small, greedy man. He deserved to be discarded, but the structure he built, the influence, the reach, That was an instrument. And you have blunted it. I've broken it, Hamish corrected, his tone sharpening. And I think you're going to find that the police in Strathbane, even a man as dense as Blair, have a very simple way of dealing with people who manipulate crime scenes. Blair? Julian laughed, a dry, humourless sound. Blair is a dullard who cares only for his career. If I can provide him with the evidence that Mackenzie acted alone, that the solicitor was a rogue element who stole the ledger to hide his own crimes, well, would you like to guess who he will believe? The heroic priest who assisted in the investigation, or the unruly local Bobby who refuses to cut his hair? Hamish felt a cold knot of dread tighten in his stomach. The priest was right. Blair was the weak link. If Julian managed to spin the story before the truth could take root, the entire case could be twisted into a disaster that would leave Hamish, and the truth, in the dirt. I think you've underestimated one thing, Father, Hamish said, taking a slow step forward. And what is that? That I'm not just a local Bobby, Hamish said, his hand slowly drifting toward his pocket. I'm a man who listens to what people don't say. You've been so busy looking at the big picture, the ledgers, the land, the power, that you forgot about the small things. Like the fact that you weren't the only one recording things in this village. He pulled a small digital tape recorder from his pocket. It wasn't high-tech, and it was a bit battered, but it had a clear, blinking red light. I visited the vicar this morning, Hamish lied, his face as innocent as a lamb. He's a nervous man, but he's also a man who spent a lot of time in your company. He mentioned that you had a habit of reciting your plans aloud when you thought you were alone in the vestry. He's been keeping a very detailed record of your confessions, Father. The colour drained from Julian's face. He lunged forward, his hand clawing for the recorder. But Hamish was faster. He stepped nimbly aside, his long legs moving with a speed that belied his lazy reputation. Careful now, Hamish cautioned. This is evidence. If you break it, you'll be adding obstruction of justice and assault to the list. I think conspiracy to commit murder is quite enough for one afternoon, don't you? Julian stopped, his chest heaving, his eyes darting toward the open church door. The rain outside was torrential now, a curtain of grey isolating them from the world. You don't have a recording, Julian hissed, his voice trembling with rage. You're bluffing, maybe, Hamish said, holding the recorder tight. But do you want to take that gamble? Do you want to sit in a holding cell in Strathbane and wait for Blair to find out if I'm lying? I've already called him, Father. He's on his way. He's not coming for a chat. He's coming to make an arrest. It was another lie, but it was the perfect one. Father Julian stood still, his gaze flickering between the door and Hamish's calm, unmoving face. The silence of the church returned, deeper and more profound than before. The priest was calculating the odds, realizing that for the first time in his life he had been outmaneuvered by a man who looked like he spent his days sleeping in a barn. You realize, Julian said softly, his voice once again smooth as ice, that if you do this, there is no going back to your quiet little life. I've never had a quiet life, Hamish replied, his smile barely reaching his eyes. I just have a very patient one, and right now it's run out of patience. He turned and walked toward the church door, his hand still firmly on the recorder. He didn't look back to see if the priest followed. He knew that for all his talk of power, Julian was a coward at heart, a man who thrived only when he could control the narrative. Now that the story was spinning out of his reach, he was just another man in a black suit, standing in an empty room, waiting for the inevitable. Chapter 10. The quiet return and the unseen promotion. The rain had finally abated, leaving the air in Lochdevoff, tasting of ozone and wet pine. By the time DCI Blair's sirens reached the village, the storm had moved on to batter the coast, and the church was nothing more than a silent sentinel under a bruised purple sky. Hamish stood by the entrance to the police station, his arms crossed over his chest, looking for all the world like a man waiting for a bus that was never coming. Beside him, Luggs was busily sniffing at a clump of damp heather. Blair's Rover screeched to a halt, spraying gravel everywhere. Blair jumped out, looking even more purple and indignant than usual. Beside him, a pair of uniformed officers were already hustling a pale, stone-faced Father Julian into the back of the vehicle. Macbeth, Blair roared, marching up to him. What in the hell is going on? I've got a solicitor confessing to drowning a man, and a priest demanding a lawyer and quoting canon law, and all of it started because you decided to play detective instead of directing traffic." Hamish looked at his boots, then slowly up at the DCI, his expression one of perfect bovine bewilderment. "Och, sir, I was just trying to keep the peace. Mackenzie came to me, all in a heap, and what with the bell ringing and all, it seemed a bit of a crisis. I just followed the trail like." Blair glared at him, his small piggy eyes narrowing. "You handed the notebook to Anderson. Anderson found the entries about the extortion. It's a mess, Macbeth, a total bureaucratic nightmare." "I'm sorry, sir," Hamish said, sounding appropriately crushed. "I know I'm not much for the paperwork. Maybe I should just stick to the beat and keep out of the big stuff." Blair snorted, wiping the rain from his forehead. "You're damn right you should. You're a liability, Macbeth. A complete, unvarnished, lazy liability. If I had my way, I'd have you moved to the traffic division in Glasgow by tomorrow morning." Hamish felt his heart soar, though he kept his face mournful. "Glasgow, that would be a terrible shame, sir. I'm not sure I'd manage in the big city." Blair paused, looking at Hamish's genuinely pained expression. He realized, with a sudden, sour clarity, that the local bobby was absolutely terrified of leaving his little patch of nowhere, and for some reason the thought made Blair feel a strange, spiteful sense of satisfaction. "Keep your job then," Blair spat. "Stay here in your mud and your rain, but if I ever hear of you investigating a murder again, I'll have your badge before you can blink." "You hear me? Loud and clear, sir," Hamish said, touching his cap with a trembling hand. "Thank you, sir. I'll stay out of the way, I promise." Blair stomped back to his car, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the chassis. With a spray of mud, the police vehicles turned and disappeared back down the glen, leaving Lochdabuff in the deepening evening quiet. Hamish stood there for a long time, watching the tail lights fade into the mist. He let out a long, shuddering breath of relief. He had done it. The case was closed, the villains were in custody, and he had successfully convinced his boss that he was too dim-witted to ever be considered for promotion. He looked down at Lugs, who was currently watching a moth flutter around the porch light. "We did it, boy," Hamish whispered, his voice warm. "We saved the village, and we get to stay exactly where we are." He walked back into the station, the familiar comforting smell of damp wool and old coffee greeting him. He went straight to the stove, lit the burner, and set the kettle on. Outside, the Highland wind began to howl again, but here, in the heart of his home, everything was exactly as it should be. He didn't need medals. He didn't need a transfer to a bigger desk or a nicer uniform. He had the silence of the mountains, the gossip of the shop, and a life that was measured in pots of tea and quiet, uneventful days. As the kettle began to whistle, Hamish sat down in his armchair, pulled his feet toward the heat, and picked up a dog-eared book from the side table. He opened it, stretched his legs out, and closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the peace that he had fought so hard to keep. Lochdabuff was safe, and more importantly, Hamish Macbeth was still, happily, just a local policeman, with absolutely nothing to do but watch the rain and wait for tomorrow. Chapter 1:1 The Return of the Midge and the Missing Salmon. The days following the arrest of Father Julian and Mr. Mackenzie were characterized by a quietude so profound it felt almost tangible. In Lochdabuff, news travelled not by telephone or text, but by the subtle shift in the way people stood in the doorway of Patel's shop, or the intensity with which they stirred their tea in the hotel lounge. The Craigmore incident, as it was now being called, had been neatly filed away by the villagers as a classic case of Sassenach madness. Hamish, meanwhile, had returned to his natural state of equilibrium. He was once again the village policeman who seemed to spend more time leaning against his bicycle than pedalling it, and whose primary contribution to public safety was ensuring no one tripped over his sleeping dog. On a bright, crisp Saturday morning, he was standing at the edge of the loch, enjoying the rare sight of the sun glinting off the water. The mountains were wearing their best shades of purple and green, and the air was finally free of that heavy, threatening mist. "Peace at last," Lugs, Hamish murmured, reaching into his pocket to pull out a small, dried crust of bread. No priests, no solicitors, no fancy wellness gurus telling us how to breathe. Lugs offered a short, happy bark, his tail wagging in rhythm with the gentle lapping of the water. Hamish's peace was interrupted by the crunch of footsteps on the gravel path. He didn't turn around. He recognized the brisk, purposeful walk of Elspeth Grant, the local schoolteacher. Elspeth was a woman of sharp mind and sharper tongue, and she had a habit of appearing exactly when Hamish was trying to be his most unproductive. "Good morning, Hamish," she said, stopping beside him. She looked at him with an expression that was halfway between fondness and exasperation. "I hear the Strathbane police have finally finished their report. They've labelled the whole affair a tragic misunderstanding orchestrated by a corrupt solicitor. Father Julian is apparently being transferred to a secure facility in the south for psychological evaluation. Is that a fact?" Hamish asked, not looking away from the lock. "That is the rumour," Elspeth said, leaning against the wooden fence, "and the general consensus in the village is that if you hadn't been so inept at following procedure, the whole thing would have dragged on for months. Mr. Patel is quite convinced you're a genius in disguise, though I told him it was just a matter of you wanting to get back to your coffee." Hamish chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. "Mr. Patel gives me too much credit, Elspeth. I just wanted a bit of quiet. It's not a lot to ask for, is it? In this village. It's a miracle," she replied, her gaze softening. She reached into her basket and pulled out a thermos. "I brought you some coffee, proper, strong coffee, not the sludge you get from the hotel." Hamish took the thermos, his eyes lighting up. "Now, that's what I call police work, Elspeth. A lady who knows the way to a man's heart is through his caffeine intake." They stood in silence for a few minutes, watching a local fishing boat cut a neat wake across the loch. For a brief moment, the shadow of the past week felt like a bad dream, something that had happened to someone else in some other place. But then, a sharp, familiar sting on his forearm brought him back to reality. "Ow," Hamish muttered, swatting at his arm. "The midges are back. A sign that life is truly returning to normal." Elspeth laughed. "If we have midges, we have the Highlands. And if we have the Highlands, we have you, Constable." As Elspeth walked back toward the village, Hamish watched her go, a quiet contentment settling over him. He knew that Lockdove would always hold its secrets, and he knew that there would always be another intruder, another problem, another mystery waiting in the wind. But for now, the sky was blue, the coffee was excellent, and he had nothing to do for the rest of the day. He walked back to his station, his spirits high. He reached the door and stopped dead. Sitting on his front step was a large, beautifully wrapped parcel. He frowned, wondering if he had forgotten to pay for something. He leaned down and unwrapped it. Inside was a massive, perfectly cured side of smoked salmon, the finest he had ever seen. There was no note, no card, just the fish. Hamish looked left, then right. The street was empty. He picked up the salmon, a slow, knowing grin spreading across his face. He knew exactly who had left it, and he knew exactly why. It was the village's silent "thank you," a bribe to keep him exactly as he was, lazy, observant, and firmly in their corner. "Well, Lugs," Hamish said, stepping inside and kicking the door shut against the world, "I suppose that settles dinner for the next week. Life is grand, wouldn't you say?" He set the salmon on his kitchen table, poured a cup of Elspeth's coffee, and sat down in his armchair. He was the protector of Lockdove, the keeper of its peace, and as long as he had his tea, his dog, and a bit of smoked salmon, he didn't mind the chaos one bit. The mystery was gone, but the life, the beautiful, stubborn, Highland life was just beginning again. Chapter 12. The Sunday stroll and the lingering echo Sunday in Lockdove was always the slowest day of the week, a time when the very air seemed to thicken with the scent of roasting mutton and the distant, rhythmic chiming of the church bells. For Hamish Macbeth, it was the ultimate test of his constitution, the day when he had to remain perfectly steadfastly idle. He emerged from the police station just as the morning light was beginning to chase the remnants of the dew from the grass. He was wearing his oldest, most comfortable jumper, the one with the frayed sleeves and the vague smell of wood smoke, and his pipe was tucked securely into the corner of his mouth. Lugs was already 3 paces ahead, his tail a metronome of pure, unadulterated, canine joy. The village looked different today. The tension that had gripped the streets for the past week, the hushed whispers, the averted gazes, the fear of what the spiritual retreat might bring, had evaporated. People were walking to church in their Sunday best, their faces bright with the simple relief of returning to their familiar, predictable lives. Hamish tipped his cap to Mrs. Danvers as she hurried past, clutching her prayer book. "Lovely morning, Hamish," she called out, a genuine brightness in her tone. "Are you off to find some trouble?" "Oh, no, Mrs. Danvers," Hamish drawled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Just off to find a bit of sun. Trouble can find me if it's really that desperate." He wandered down to the pier, where the water was so still it acted like a polished obsidian mirror for the surrounding peaks. He found his usual spot on a mossy, flat-topped rock, sat down, and struck a match for his pipe. As the aromatic smoke curled into the crisp Highland air, he found his thoughts drifting back to the case. He thought of Father Julian, currently sitting in a cold, sterile cell in the south, likely trying to calculate how he had been undone by a man who couldn't be bothered to lace his boots properly. He thought of Mackenzie, the man who had let his fear turn into something ugly and irreparable. It was a strange thing about murder, Hamish reflected. It rarely began with a grand, cinematic explosion. It began with a small, sharp edge of jealousy, or a secret that had been guarded for too long, or a person who simply felt they were above the quiet rules of the community. In Lochdoverf, those edges were usually smoothed over by years of shared history and the relentless grinding patience of the Highlands. But sometimes an outsider brought their own jagged edges, and the result was always a mess that fell to Hamish to clean up. He watched a seagull swoop low over the water, its cry echoing lonely and sharp against the cliffs. He realized that while he had solved the case, the scars would remain. The village would talk about the Craigmore incident for years, perhaps even decades. It would become a fixture of local folklore, a cautionary tale told in the pub to anyone foolish enough to put on airs. But for Hamish, the case was already receding into the past, like a pebble dropped into a deep loch. His phone, the black, archaic instrument in the station, was silent. His radio was quiet. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he wasn't looking for a motive, a lie, or a hiding place. He was just a man, a dog, and a pipe, watching the world turn slowly under a Highland sun. He stood up, brushed the lichen from his trousers, and whistled for lugs. They walked back along the shoreline, past the colourful boats bobbing gently at their moorings, and toward the heart of the village. As they passed the hotel, he saw the new owner of the Craigmore estate's remaining interests, a local developer, talking earnestly with the minister. "They'll build something else, won't they?" Hamish thought, a slight, knowing smile touching his lips. Maybe a B&B or a holiday cottage. It didn't matter. The Highlands had a way of absorbing change, of wearing it down until it matched the colour of the mountains and the rhythm of the tides. Lochdoverf would survive. It had been here long before Pendleton's money, and it would be here long after the story of his demise had been forgotten. He reached his front door, turned the key, and stepped into the cool, shadowed interior of the station. He hung up his cap on the rack, took off his sweater, and poured a final cup of coffee. He sat in his armchair, the one with the worn-out springs that moulded to his frame like a second skin. Outside, the church bells stopped ringing. The village went quiet, settling into the sacred stillness of a Sunday afternoon. Hamish leaned his head back against the cushion and closed his eyes. He didn't think about crimes. He didn't think about his boss. He didn't think about the world beyond the glen. He just listened to the steady, rhythmic breathing of lugs at his feet and the soft, comforting ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece. He was home. He was safe. And as far as he was concerned, that was the greatest mystery of all, that in a world so full of noise and ambition, he had managed to find exactly the piece of the world he was meant to be in, and he had absolutely no intention of ever letting it go. The Highland wind sighed against the window, a lonely, ancient sound, but Hamish didn't stir. He was already drifting off, a small, satisfied smile on his face, ready for a dreamless sleep in the heart of the only place that mattered.